Okay, so you've come to us with a really interesting document about setting up a company in Egypt.
It is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, and specifically, you're looking at the different types of capital companies,
Right.
and you want to like make sense of them.
Yeah, cut through all the legal jargon.
Exactly, and that's exactly what we're going to try to do today. We got
Awesome.
this questionnaire from Consortio law firm called
It's called the Questionnaire about Companies and Corporation in Egypt.
Right.
And it was actually prepared by their corporate team as of August 2024.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's just dive right in.
Sure.
The first company type that they talk about is the limited liability company,
Right. An LLC.
an LLC. So what is that? Like, what's the fundamental idea behind it?
So basically, an LLC in Egypt is considered a closed company.
Okay.
And so the kind of main thing is each partner's liability is limited to the value of their investment,
Gotcha.
which are these things called quotas or allotments.
Right, like there are shares in the company.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's the main kind of thing with an LLC.
So there are partners involved, though, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Like more than one person.
Yeah. So you have to have at least 2 partners,
Right.
and you can't have more than 50.
Gotcha.
Okay, so it is like a fairly small group.
So if I was like thinking, okay, I'm going to start this huge company,
Right.
and eventually go public, an LLC is probably not the structure I'd go with.
Exactly, because you're right. Those quotas, those allotments can't be traded on a stock exchange.
Gotcha. Okay, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
What about like the name of the LLC? Are there any rules about like how you have to name it?
Yeah, so the name usually has to reflect the company's business.
Okay.
You can include the names of one or more partners,
Mm-hmm.
but the phrase limited liability company has to be part of the name.
So people know what they're dealing with.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, now this questionnaire also mentions that LLCs are reasonably easy to manage.
Right.
So what makes them easy to manage?
Well, like we were saying, it's a pretty small group of people,
Right.
so decision-making should be pretty streamlined. Okay. Which hopefully means lower administrative costs.
Yeah, and that's huge for any small business.
Exactly.
You know, just starting out.
Right.
So that's cool.
Mhm.
What about the money side of things? Is there a minimum capital requirement to set one of these up?
This is interesting. So there's actually no minimum capital required for an LLC.
Really?
Yeah, which is pretty attractive, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty low barrier to entry.
Right. Especially if you're just starting out and you don't have a ton of money.
Totally.
Of course, there might be some drawbacks, you know,
Right.
depending on your industry, if you need to like project a certain level of financial stability, I guess.
That's a good point.
But yeah, no minimum capital requirement.
Very cool. All right, and how about management, like day-to-day, who's running the show?
So there's no limit on the number of managers,
Okay.
which is pretty flexible.
Yeah, you can kind of structure it however you want.
Right, exactly.
Cool. All right, so we've got limited liability for partners, a limit on the number of partners, ownership stakes that aren't publicly traded, specific naming rules.
Yeah,
It's relatively easy to manage,
hopefully.
and there's no minimum capital requirement.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the LLC. Now let's talk about joint stock companies,
All right, JSEs.
JSCs. And I'm guessing this is where things get a little more complicated.
Yeah, it definitely does get a bit more complex.
Okay,
So there are actually 2 ways to incorporate a JSC in Egypt.
2 different ways.
Yeah.
Okay, what are they?
So the first one is called immediate incorporation. And in this case, the founders are the only shareholders, and the shares aren't offered to the public.
So it's basically a private company.
Exactly like a closed JSC. And the regulations are a little bit easier for this type. The other method is incorporation through public subscription.
Right.
And this is where shares are offered to the general public.
So if you wanted to go public eventually, you'd have to go this route?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. What about the upfront costs? Is there a minimum capital requirement for a JSC?
Yes, there is. And it's a lot higher than the LLC.
Okay, how much are we talking?
You have to have at least 250,000 Egyptian pounds.
Wow, that's a pretty big difference.
Yeah, it is.
So that's something to think about right there. Do you have to pay that all at once, or is there like a payment plan?
So you can pay it all at once if you want, but you can also do it in phases.
Okay, how does that work?
So you have to pay at least 10% when you incorporate,
Right.
then another 25% within 3 months, and then the rest within 5 years.
Okay, so that's a little bit easier to swallow.
Yeah, it definitely gives you some breathing room.
Right, okay, so how many people have to be involved in a JSC?
You need at least 3 shareholders.
Okay, even for the immediate incorporation type.
Yeah, that's right.
Interesting. Okay, so you and your buddy can't just start a JSC.
Exactly. You need to find at least one more person.
Okay, so who's actually making decisions in a JSC?
So in a JSC, you have a board of directors, or BOD, and there has to be at least 3 members on the board, and they're elected by the shareholders.
Okay, so that's kind of like a more traditional corporate structure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's definitely more formal than an LLC.
And now the questionnaire mentions that JSCs are complex to manage.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, there are a few reasons.
Okay.
First, the capital in a JSC is divided into shares, and those shares have to be deposited with something called the central depository system.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it gets complicated.
Okay.
Then all the shareholders have to be registered or coded in the Egyptian exchange market.
Uh-huh.
And anytime there's a management decision about those shares, you
Yeah.
have to update all those records. Yeah, it's a lot of paperwork.
Okay.
And the document actually mentions Article 127 of the Executive Regulation of Corporate Law,
Okay.
because it's really important for both incorporation methods.
Okay. And what does Article 127 say, basically?
Basically, it's all about how you register shareholders and their shares and how you keep track of everything.
Right, because you got all these shares floating around, and got to know who owns what.
Exactly. It can get really messy if you're not careful.
I bet. Okay, so that's one reason why they're complex. That's another.
So the second reason is the regulations,
Okay.
LLCs, are mainly regulated by JF, which is the General Authority for Investment and Free Zones.
Right.
But JSCs are also regulated by the FRA,
Huh.
this Financial Regulatory Authority.
Gotcha.
And the FRA has to approve a lot of the decisions that GSCs make.
Oh, wow. So you're dealing with 2 different regulatory bodies.
Exactly. And that can be a real headache.
I bet. So it's not like every little decision needs FRA approval, right?
No, not every decision.
Right.
It's mostly things that have to do with the shares,
Like what?
like issuing new shares or transferring shares, or if the company wants to change its capital structure.
Okay, so anything that could affect the shareholders, basically. Gotcha. So even though it's more complex, I guess it also gives investors more confidence.
Yeah, exactly, because there's more oversight and transparency.
Right. Okay, so more stakeholders, more regulations, but also more potential for growth.
Exactly. It's a trade-off.
Okay, cool. Now let's move on to the third type of capital company. It's called the one-person company with limited liability. This one sounds pretty simple.
Yeah, it's the most straightforward of the 3.
Okay, so how does it work?
So basically, it's a company that's owned by just one person or one other company.
Okay, so it's for solo entrepreneurs or maybe small businesses that are like wholly owned by another company.
Exactly.
Gotcha. And what about liability for the owner? Are their personal assets protected?
Yeah, so just like with an LLC, the owner's liability is limited to the amount of share capital that they put in.
Okay, so their personal stuff is safe.
Exactly.
Cool. Is there a minimum capital requirement for this one?
Yes, there is.
Okay.
It's 1,000 Egyptian pounds.
Okay. And you have to pay that all at once.
That's right. Yeah, you have to pay it all when you incorporate the company.
Gotcha. Okay, so we've got the LLC with no minimum capital,
Uh-huh.
the JSC with a 250,000 EGP minimum, and the one-person company with a 1,000 EGP minimum. Okay, so there you go, listeners. A range of options depending on your budget. So now you got to figure out which structure is right for you.
Yeah, exactly.
So what are some of the things you should be thinking about?
So first, you have to think about how many owners there will be. An LLC can have 2 to 50.
Mm-hmm.
A JSC needs at least 3.
Yep.
And one-person company obviously just has 1.
Right, so that's a big one right there.
Yeah, if you've got partners, you're probably not going to go with the one-person company.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, what else?
Then, of course, there's the money.
Right, the minimum capital,
Exactly.
no minimum for the LLC, 1,000 for the one-person company,
Uh-huh.
and 250,000 for the JSC.
Right. So you have to look at your funding and see what you can swing.
Totally. Okay, and then what about just managing the company day to day? How do they compare?
So the LLC is usually the easiest to manage because
Oh.
it's more flexible and there are fewer regulations.
Gosh.
The JSC is the most complex.
Right, because of the shares and the 2 regulatory bodies.
Exactly.
The one-person company's somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, it can be pretty simple,
Okay,
but the owner has to do everything.
right, they're wearing all the hats.
That's right.
Okay, and then finally, what about ownership itself? Like, how easy is it to transfer ownership in these different types of companies?
So that's another key difference. LLC ownership is not publicly traded, so it's a more private process to transfer it. JSC ownership is in the form of shares, which can be publicly traded.
Right.
So it's much easier to transfer.
Okay, and then a one-person company, I'm guessing it's pretty hard to transfer ownership.
Yeah, it would basically involve selling the entire business.
Right, okay, so there you have it, folks.
A breakdown of capital companies in Egypt.
Based on the Consortio law firm questionnaire.
Exactly.
Hopefully this has given you a better understanding of the different options.
Yeah, we tried to highlight the key differences in
Right.
terms of ownership, capital management, transferability. And hopefully that'll help you make the right decision for your business.
Okay, so as you move forward with your plans for starting a business in Egypt,
Yeah.
think about this one last question. What are some crucial factors beyond just the initial capital investment that might be really important for you?
Yeah, like what are your long-term goals?
Right, exactly what's going to make your business thrive in Egypt.
That's a great question.
Yeah, something to ponder. Thanks for diving deep with us.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll catch you next time.
See you then.